the topic, as we said earlier, we try to demystify what we do, what I do. It's little understood, except by people who've been there before. And we just want to try and explain what the steps are that we would take. So if I have a conversation with a director or a board of directors or an individual about financial problems, this is the kind of approach that I would take, or we would take at TMP. Most people have not experienced this before. They're unaware of the options and the alternatives. They mostly fear the worst. There is often just relief at understanding that there are options and solutions. And as I've said already a couple of times, early warning is helpful to us because it gives you more options, greater likelihood of rescue, and even mitigate the problems that exist. The approach that we have is most importantly to understand the objectives of the stakeholders. Stakeholders could be a variety of people. Typically, we're talking to directors, shareholders, or in smaller companies, they are the same director shareholders. And they are in every business, as you know, stakeholders cover all sorts of people: debtors, creditors, financiers, employees, landlords, as well as the director shareholders. So a huge variety of people and interested parties who we are trying to accommodate as best as possible. It's often not possible to satisfy all of them, but finding the solution that maximizes the situation is what we're looking for. We then consider the financial position. It won't surprise you that that's the key part of understanding what the issue is to know about the finances. And I'll get into that in a bit more detail. We also want to understand what the creditor pressure is like. How much under the cosh are you? What's actually happening? What are creditors saying or doing to you in terms of... Sorry?
Far ahead, Neil.
And having reviewed the financials and the credit pressure, that we then look at the options. Now, this could be a variety of things. Typically, where most businesses with difficulty are starting is they're trying to raise more money or rejig their situations to maximize the cash or the limited cash that they've got. So what we call informal restructuring, when I say the word informal, that means it's not a formal insolvency process. That's the language we use. That may be with new finance or without. So rearranging things that exist without any formal process. Failing that, we do need to look at a formal insolvency or a formal process under the Insolvency Act to rescue the business. But that doesn't mean it's terminal. I'll come to the various high-level options. The danger in this is getting very technical. I don't want to do that because it can get pretty complicated. But to have a sort of shopping list of the sort of things that you're looking at and some of the words you may have heard, we'll come to that too. But that's the formal route. And failing all of that, or indeed if the objective of the stakeholders is not to continue, then to terminate the business. And there are processes like liquidation which deal with a terminal situation. So we almost leap to the conclusion that the stakeholders always want the business to survive and always want all the good things to happen. That is mostly true, and you won't be surprised. But sometimes, and there are tools, sometimes it's a tax-driven process, we'll mention that as well, but sometimes it is the end of the road, or the owner wants to go and do something else, and that is the logical objective. So don't assume that the objective is always to turn the business around. So what are the stakeholders' objectives that we see? The main one, as I've alluded to, is to keep the business alive, to review the viability of the business. It may be good in parts and not good in parts. So the next one talks about restructuring, downsizing, getting rid of loss-making parts. Those are all options in reviewing the viability of the business overall. Refinance, that is a key part. In many, many years of doing this, most successful restructurings come with some sort of refinance. That may be actual finance, as in new monies from shareholders, from lenders. It may be rejigging the creditor situation, which generates more cash and therefore is refinancing in an indirect way. But it's very seldom that a restructuring is successful over a longer period without some sort of injection of new capital. A common one is always to protect the personal position. So in other words, the directors or other stakeholders who are affected by the stress. The conversation with companies very quickly moves to the individual situations. Now, the two are very distinct. we typically advise companies as to what the company should do as directed by the board of directors, but you cannot deny that there's a huge overlap in how that affects the personal position of directors and what their liabilities are, what their risks are, when they should act, when they shouldn't act. So we always give generic advice, even though we're advising companies on what the personal position is, because it's so overlapping. The objectives may be tax-driven solutions. There's a liquidation called a members voluntary liquidation, or MVL, that is commonly used to tax efficiently distribute funds from a business that is ended or wants to end. And the main reason why it's tax efficient is that it preserves, it's a capital distribution, not income. So there's a much lower tax to be paid on monies coming out of an MVL than if it was distributed as income or dividends. And the last but not least, it may be, as I said earlier, to terminate. It may be appropriate or desired to end that company for all sorts of reasons. Sadly, sometimes it's because it can't continue. It can't meet some of the other objectives, or enough of them for it to be viable. Just briefly, what are the definitions of insolvency? This is commonly misunderstood. Many people think it's a vague sort of notion of, you just can't survive. But there are two very specific tests that we look at. So the balance sheet test simply means the company's liabilities exceed its assets. That shouldn't be surprising. That is a problem because you're going to get in less than you owe out. In the strict definition, it should include all liabilities, including contingent and prospective liabilities. Now, a simple example of that is a landlord. A landlord a lease goes on longer than just the immediate term, normally, the immediate future. The strict definition is you should look at the whole liability of that lease, even though it's not all due now. And I can tell you that on that basis, pretty much every business in the UK would be insolvent. So you do have to take this with a pinch of salt, and also to look at the other test, which is the cash flow test. So it's a balancing of all these things as to what's applicable to your situation, and then there's some more specific do's and don'ts, which we'll come on to after this. So on the balance sheet, how we look at this typically is what we call a statement of affairs. It's effectively taking a balance sheet and putting into a different format where you look at what's coming in on a very prudent knockdown sort of basis, and what's going to go out, which is a uplifted, all liabilities included, contingent or otherwise, and then see what the deficiency is, assuming there's a deficiency, and how significant it is. And that's the starting point in our world to say, what can we do to improve it from that point? So that's the base worst case scenario. What can a restructuring or a refinancing or a insolvency tool do to improve that position? And then the second significant test is the cash flow test. Very simply, the company cannot pay all debts as and when they fall due. And that is important to say that again, as and when they fall due. We all know creditors come with different sizes, flavors, credit terms, demands. If you had to pay everything today, no one would be able to survive. But you look at when they fall due. And this is why a cash flow forecast in a small business typically is very important to keep a handle on how things are actually moving in a detailed way over, say, the next 13 weeks or 3 months, and also longer term over the next year and beyond. But no one's a genius. It's not an exact science. Nobody gets a cash flow right, but it's much better to have one that is closer to reality than nothing at all. It's important to understand the definition of as and when they fall due is also something that can change if you put something in place that changes it. And the best example of a written agreement with a certain creditor is HMRC. If you, and I'm sure lots of you have seen or even dealt with time to pay agreements, which have been in place a very long time with HMRC for paying your VAT, your PAYE, and so on. If you have a written agreement with HMRC to pay over, say, 6 months, that's when those amounts are due. They're not all due on the 19th of the month or the 22nd or the 7th day after the quarter of the next month or that. They become later. So that may make a difference to whether you can pay anyone else who's due in that period. Directors, importantly, have big obligations and responsibilities. And we are very careful to point out right at the front that directors have these obligations and responsibilities under both the Companies Act and, if we're talking about this world, in the Insolvency Act as well. And essentially, the directors need to prevent the position worsening for creditors. If we advise that the company is insolvent or potentially insolvent, and we're in that so-called twilight zone, the responsibilities changed quite dramatically, and the directors really, their main focus becomes looking after the creditors of the business and not the owners, not the shareholders. And that is often blurred. It's absolutely crystal clear. When you are insolvent or potentially insolvent, your entire focus for the business is to preserve the value for the creditors and to maximize the creditors' interests. And the board must take action. In that situation, the board cannot do nothing. And unfortunately, the head in the sand syndrome is all too common because it is a scary place. But doing something will make you feel better, and it is the right thing to do. So on the financial position, what do we look at? Latest management accounts, as recent as possible, as accurate as possible. Poor financial controls in a business are often the cause, unfortunately, of distress and cash flow difficulties because the company doesn't have a handle, the directors don't have a handle on the true position. And equally, as I said earlier, about cash flow forecasts, very important to have in some shape or form rather than nothing. Try and work out in a simple spreadsheet, whatever, to work out what's going to be happening over the next few weeks or months. Statement of affairs, I've already referred to. That's our version of the balance sheet, which shows what the ins and the outs are and what the deficit is. And then leading from that, a comparison of outcome. Starting with the base worst case scenario, what can we do to improve the position and restructure or turn the business around if possible? Or if it's an insolvency or something terminal, to mitigate the position of the creditors as much as possible. A couple of key things we always ask about day one are these last two. And in fact, there's a third one, which I was reminded to on the call we just had. The first one is intercompany loans. If there's a group structure with various companies that have interdependencies on each other or loans going various ways in the group, that is a potential problem. And the reason that's a problem is that if you try and isolate the one company that's having a difficulty and do, say, a formal insolvency, any monies owed back to that company will have to be recovered. Those monies will have to be recovered at some point, and that could have a knock-on effect on the company that owes the money. So right up front, we need to understand what the group structure is, do a simple chart of the various entities and arrows showing where the amounts are owed, how significant it is, what the agreements are, if any, between those monies. But sadly, there's often in a small group structure, very fluid situation where they're kind of all being treated as one entity, but in insolvency, you have to look at every entity separately and look at its own creditors and its own debtors. So intercompany structure, absolutely key to understand. And secondly, the director loan accounts. In a similar but different way, if individuals, particularly directors, have borrowed money from a company or taken money out and not called it salary or not called it dividends or whatever it might later be done, and it's very typical in small companies that at the end of the financial year, the external accountant says, well, now that you've got this loan, you can do this with that, or recall it that, or journal it over here. But if the music stops before that, you're left with a situation where money is owed by an individual to a company that's going to go into some sort of insolvency. And that amount, a bit like an intercompany loan, will be called on. So that doesn't help the individual, and a liquidator or an administrator can't look kindly on a director and say, it's been terribly tough for you, we can ignore that. That is not an option. So if there are outstanding loan accounts, that is a potential problem. And it may mean the individual also needs to look at the options for them as an individual alongside what's happening with the company. And it's not uncommon, unfortunately, that directors have to deal with financial problems at the same time that a company does. But it's best to address that right up front so that you know how all companies and individuals are going to be affected by the restructuring. The third one, which is not on here, is personal guarantees. It's very common that individuals give guarantees for debts. That may be all sorts of things, but it may be a lease for a landlord. It may be a creditor, so a specific creditor. Typically, it's a bank, a personal guarantee on an overdraft facility or loan. That has to also be dealt with and understood. And the reason, no surprise, is that similar to director loan account, if that liability is not going to be paid by the entity that owes it, the individual is going to be called on, and that sits outside. It can't be dealt with as part of a corporate wrapping up. It's got to be dealt with separately. So a similar but different problem. Creditor pressure, I mentioned right at the outset. It's very important to understand what the relationships are like with the company and its various creditors. It's also important, although this is getting a bit technical, the different types of creditors that you get. And in very simple terms, the main three are secured, preferential, and unsecured. Secured is typically a bank. You have given a debenture, a fixed and floating charge of something like that to a bank for your lending. That is a secured creditor. Secured creditor has rights that trump all other creditors because they effectively can do their own thing in terms of recalling their monies or going after guarantees, whatever's been put in place. So secured creditors have much more rights of enforceability. Preferential has changed over the years, but now, as in the last 3 years or so, HMRC, the Crown, has got back its preferential status in an insolvency procedure, which means pretty much all VAT and PAYE and most national insurance is preferential to all other unsecured creditors. So in the pecking order, they come first. And that's important, not for today's conversation, but in terms of how you would structure and how you need to review sort of waterfall of what's going to happen in a process. And then below all of that are the unsecured, all the other creditors, trade, other certain parts of, and certain employees have preferential claims. There are two categories of preferential. That's getting far too technical. Everyone else is unsecured. Landlords, trade creditors, certain parts of employees, anyone else owed money, directors, unless they're secured, or other companies, unless they're secured, all unsecured, all rank equally subject to their value. But from our point of view, we need to understand what those categories are and how significant each of them are. But more importantly, how are you getting on with them? Are you talking to your lenders? Are you talking to your trade creditors? The ones that are giving you grief, are you communicating? Are you trying to make something happen? Are you ignoring it? This is what we need to understand. And then more specifically, what is the level of pressure in terms of documentation? Are they writing? Is there correspondence, emails between the parties? Have they written to you through their lawyers? And then more seriously, has a statutory demand been issued? Or even worse, a winding up petition? If you at that stage, a winding up petition, that is basically a petition to wind up or liquidate the company. That is quite late in the day. It's not fatal. There are things that can be done, but when I talked about early warning, that would not count as early warning. If you've got a statute demand, there are definitely ways to deal with it, to respond, to dispute, or whatever you might be doing with the stat demand, to buy yourself some time. And even if it goes beyond that, stat demands can ultimately be set aside if you come up with a structure that's acceptable to that creditor. And then finally, a very special category of creditor is a landlord. Landlord have certain rights about what they can enforce and retake the property and so on. I'm not going to go into that in any detail at all, other than to say we need to understand if the company's got a landlord or landlords and what the effect of that relationship is and what the effect of their rights of enforcement are. The twilight zone is what we sometimes refer to as the period when the company knows or ought to know it's an insolvency, or has been told by somebody like me that it's pretty much in an insolvent state. That is different from going into an insolvency process. So in other words, you're aware that the company is in a state where the cash flow test isn't met, or the balance sheet test, or both haven't been met. And on that basis, as I've said before, the obligation switches to responsibility to creditors. But along that journey, there are some key no-nos which the company needs to start adopting immediately so that they are not ultimately liable as directors for wrongful trading or fraudulent trading or any of those terms you may have heard. And they're pretty straightforward in concept. In practice, they can be a little bit contradictory sometimes, but I think most people get it when we explain what they are and why they've got to be adhered to. And I've put down 3 of them here, and then a comment about documenting decisions. So the 3 are to not worsen the creditor's position. Basically, you need to pay as you go for anything you're still using. Others, if you're not using a creditor for any further services, you draw a line, you just don't worsen their position. You try not to worsen the position of any of the creditors if possible, That in reality is incredibly hard to do because there are some that you naturally are going to need, and you're going to try and pay as you go. That's what you're trying to do, and draw a line on the past. Secondly, you don't want to create any preferences. You don't want to prefer one creditor over another. Now, without getting into the intricacies of secured versus preferential and so on, secured are different, and you would have a reason for dealing with the secured creditor differently because they are secured and have rights. But I'm talking more generally about all the other creditors. Do you pay your employees before you pay HMRC for last month's PAYE? Do you pay your landlord before you pay your key trade supplier? Do you pay a bit of both? Or all? Those are the crunchy problems you have in reality. And the starting point is not to prefer anyone. In other words, strictly speaking, if you make any payments, you should pay everybody pro rata to what they are owed. That's never going to happen, I can tell you. And there's a get out. The get out is if you can justify why a particular payment or payments is for the good of the business as a whole, that's what you want to be able to show. Is paying your employees good for preserving the business as a whole and therefore all other creditors' positions? Probably yes, because otherwise your employees are going to walk out the door and you'll have no business and no creditor is going to get anything. So every time you have some difficult decision to make about paying a creditor or an employee or a landlord, you need to think about whether that can be justified as the good of the business and all other creditors as a whole. And the third one is to not sell any assets at an undervalue. Ideally, unless it's strategic, you probably don't want to sell any assets at all because that looks like a knee-jerk reaction to getting rid of something just to get some cash in. If it's for value and you can justify the value, that's absolutely fine. But it's where you start, desperately selling things that are worth more. A creditor can later attack that, and a liquidator can say, you sold that for less than it was worth, and you've done the creditors out of what they were entitled to. So all of that should be documented in some way. And this is where a lot of companies are very poor at recording anything, even in good times. But board meetings, and it sounds too posh saying board minutes, but even as a notebook, just writing down what you're doing and agreeing with your fellow directors, such as which creditors are being paid and why, on the basis that I've just explained how you can justify that. You might want to be recording how it's going with your fundraising if that's what you're doing, or you may be out of cash because some big debtor hasn't paid you or they've deferred and that's become a problem. You want to keep track of all those things about the incoming side, which ultimately underpins why you're going to do what you're going to do for the overall business. And what we call the blue sky of, the never-ending money that's going to come in, you've got to keep a realistic eye on that. And at some point, if you can say why that money is no longer going to come in, then you will have a different decision to make. But while there's a reasonable prospect of these money, whatever they might be, happening, you need to record that as the basis for why you are continuing to trade. And I can also tell you that it's very difficult for anybody to justify decisions later or to remember why they did certain things on a certain day, even a month later, get 3 months later or more. So justifying what you've done is really important, and to be able to demonstrate you did that to someone later is very important. So at a very high level, these are the kind of things we then come to as options. Clearly, there's an option to do nothing. That's very seldom advisable, given the situation. It may be you can get more funds from shareholders, shareholder funding call, a rights issue, whatever it might be, or finance from another party. But it's very, very difficult to raise money when you are in a distressed situation, because no lender wants to put in money and see it all go to past creditors rather than for the goodwill or the working capital of the business going forward. So if you can't get new money in, you might be able to do some sort of informal workout. Remembering informal means not a formal insolvency process. And that could be prolonging your creditors, coming to written agreements with them, like a time to pay, or taking all your key creditors and coming to a written agreement as to how you're going to pay them over a longer period of time. Failing all of that, this is in a sort of logical order, as you're probably gathering. A CVA is a company voluntary arrangement, is a formal process under the Insolvency Act where you are effectively compromising your creditors. Very technical, but it's a blank sheet of paper to write a proposal that is acceptable to your creditors and have it enforced. That is a very good tool for a viable company. If you can show that subject to your problem, despite your problems now, you are going to be viable and generate cash in the future. A CVA is the tool that you want to be thinking about. Restructuring plan is a newish plan that's very technical and very expensive, hardly ever applicable, we think, to small companies. And on that basis, I'm not even going to talk more about what it is. And then you've got the sale of the whole or parts of businesses. So if you've got bits that you can genuinely get rid of for money that's going to help the rest of the business, that may well be an option. And it may be in conjunction with one of the options on this list. I'm sure you've all heard of administration, or particularly pre-packed administration. Admin is also a rescue tool under the Insolvency Act. It's effectively, unlike a CVA, it doesn't keep the company alive, it keeps the business alive. It enables the business to be sold to another entity and keep going, or part of the business keep going. And that is generally a more expensive process. It can outweigh, the benefits can outweigh small companies who could do it in a more elegant way. But admin is a staple tool in the UK for rescuing businesses or parts of businesses. And finally, liquidation, as we said, maybe it's the objectives, maybe none of the others are possible. A liquidation is mostly used in a terminal situation to tidy up a company that is no longer going to trade, and to deal with the creditors in the most effective way and get them a return, if possible, through a formal insolvency process. And that is my trot through very much our approach to insolvency, and what questions to ask up front, what to understand about what the implications are at hopefully a higher level and less technical level.
Neil, that was very, very good, a very comprehensive overview. It seems a strange topic to raise with founders, but we've always been the strong belief that founders need to be armed with knowledge and have different options in different positions and different financial situations they find themselves in. So any questions for Neil, whilst we've got Neil on today?
Neil, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, I'm about to do that.
Hi. Sorry, it's Peter Jones here. Hi, everyone. Hi, Ollie.
Hi, Peter.
I think, first of all, I think this is probably an area that I think more people need to know about, especially with startups, because given the failure rate, the process of having to deal with, failing to get your investment or the business sort of running out of money means that pretty much everything you said needs to be put into place. But one thing, this is specific around employees. What is sort of the best sort of practice in terms of if you can see that cash flow is going to get really tight and get to the point where you start needing to let people go? Could you give us a quick overview in terms of what the process should be, and at what point you should start sort of planning? Because I've had experience, unfortunately, of companies that have just left it right to the last minute and everyone's just been let go. And then others where they have actually planned it and have done as much as they possibly can with the cash flow that's available.
Sure. No, thank you, Peter. It is a key part of any restructuring is dealing with employees. And it won't surprise you that it's a very technical and very legal issue. Employment law generally is pretty complicated and far-reaching, and doing the right thing can be tricky. We would almost always caveat advice about employees with that comment and say, if it's a very specific issue you've got, employment lawyer would need to be involved, and often is. But the general guidance I would give is, in a restructuring that is looking to a business that's trying to survive, is unfortunately you do need to probably make a decision earlier and harder than you would otherwise want to do. And you've got one effective chance to cut, and you need to cut deep. I know that sounds horrendous. It's never fun, but you have got to make a strategic decision early on and carry it through. What a lot of people don't know is that if it's part of restructuring where you're going to go into a formal process, and let's take a company voluntary arrangement as a sort of prime rescue tool where the business is viable, what would typically happen is that the redundancies would be made, say, this week, with it while you're engaged with talking to somebody like me. knowing that that's part of a strategic plan for the business to survive. And after this week, you would then start the process of the proposals, the notice, and so on, which starts the formal process. And the key reason why you want to make the decisions about the employees before you get into the process is because then they become creditors in the process. And at worst, you're not going to pay them anything today when that happens, because you may not be able to afford to. The employees do get some benefits or some repayment of amounts owed from the government once it goes into a formal process. So in my example, once the company's been approved to start a CVA, that date is the effective date for the employee's claim to kick off. So whatever they're owed in terms of arrears of pay, holiday pay, lieu of notice, redundancy itself, or any other payments that were promised to them, that all falls into different categories for a submission. And that's done, we use an agent for that. It's all done through, a lot of form filling and so on, but that process starts, and employees would get certain elements of those claims subject to statutory limits. So typically higher paid employees won't recover all of it. They'll recover some of it subject to the government's caps at some stage in the 4 to 8 weeks following the process. So it's not great, but it's better than getting something or nothing, something much further down the line or nothing at all. So employees do have a way of recovering some of it. But yes, I think the commercial answer is you want to make the difficult decisions sooner and harder than you might expect.
Okay, thank you. That's really useful.
Good question, Peter. Any additional questions for Neil, please?
Yeah. Neil, I think perhaps, can you touch on the importance of where the IP lies when somebody calls you?
Thanks, Andrea. Yes, I did think of mentioning it during the presentation and completely forgot. In the same way that Peter's observed that a lot of directors of new companies ought to know more about this before they start, they also ought to know that structuring the business or the parts of the business in appropriate way is important in case things go wrong. And to use a very simple example, and I think what Andrea is referring to is, if you have one company that has everything in it, so the operations, the intellectual property, the employees, the landlord, all the debts and all the amounts owed all in one place, and the funding, that's fine in concept, keeps it simple, and there's a lot to be applauded for that. But if that company runs into difficulty and the intellectual property is sitting in that company, it's going to be lost possibly along the way as part of whatever restructuring is there. So if you had a situation which is quite common, where you had some sort of holding company and a subsidiary which is the operating company, and the IP is sitting up at the top level, as long as you don't trip over the intercompany debts and the things I referred to during the presentation, then it may be that you can deal with the operating company that sits below. And I'm being very generic here, but I think you'll understand what I'm saying. Deal with the operations and deal with the creditors and all the mess that's going on in the operating company, while preserving the value for ultimately the stakeholders in the top company, or indeed deal with it differently, sell it on, or be able to deal with it without the clutter of the distress of the operation. Andrea, does that answer the question?
Yep, it does, Neil, because I've seen people get into a real mess with that and lose their IP because, of course, the liquidator can sell it.
Yeah, exactly. Quite right.
Thanks, Andrea. Lorenzo, did you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Ollie, and thank you, Neil, for the presentation.
No.
My question is, so essentially, how early is early? The first warning, essentially, that people should really think about in terms of the restructuring process. So, is it essentially something that every month you need to check, obviously, your cash flows, I imagine, and your balance sheet positions, and essentially, if once it seems a little bit misaligned, let's say in 3 months' time, then you would start considering these things?
No.
Or,
yeah.
It's just like, because obviously you don't want to not give the early warning, but on the other side, you don't want to, let's say, panic somehow a little bit too early. So,
yeah, fair enough.
Is there a recipe there?
Yeah, no, Lorenzo, it's a very good question. What early means to me is that, firstly, yes, I think you're right. It would be good practice for a company to look at its cash flow position on a regular basis. And I would say monthly is at a minimum. Financial people will be doing it more often if they're on top of it. But directors should be aware of what it looks like. And I think it's not going to be early warning is normally when there's some sort of trigger. So in looking at your cash flows, and it may come back to, say you're trying to raise some money, or there is a problem with a debtor who's not paying you when you expected them to, or they've asked for a installment process which you weren't expecting, and now that means you can't afford to pay your liabilities on the dates they were due. Something happening like that would be a pause for thought and thinking, right, now that that's happened, it's not looking like we thought it was. And that trigger should be at least a consideration for having a conversation. And if I was asked that question at that stage, the first thing I'd say is, can I look at your cash flow forecast? Can I look at your accounts? Can I just understand what the financial position is? It may evolve into some of the other things that I talked about financially, but essentially, I need to understand what the assumptions are and what the whole is, or what the potential whole is.
Okay, and then I have a follow-up questions, because we were mentioning startups, right? So in some cases, well, most of the cases, startups for a period of time, they deal with investors' money, right, in various different forms. So typically you would have essentially a runaway for a period of time, right, which goes 9 months, 12 months, etc., and you can use it for investments, etc., etc., etc. Usually that would be in the form of equity as opposed to
loan
debt, right, in loans or any other. Do you deal essentially with this type of situations as well, which is not technically, a traditional creditor situation? Are the signs slightly different there or not? Because I'm thinking, okay, I have money for the next 12 months, I'm covered because we are developing the product, paying the people, etc., etc., etc. But if I'm thinking I have money only for the next 6 months or 5 months or 4 months, obviously the situation is very different, although it may just be equity as opposed to any there. So
the answer is yes. Yeah, we look at all those situations, and it doesn't matter that there's some equity and some debt, because ultimately it's if you can't pay the debts, that's what the problem is. But you've raised an interesting point about investors. If you suspect you're not going to survive or be able to survive as long as you thought, you would be wanting to get possibly some advice and talk to the investors pretty soon after that, with a view to alerting them to the issue and seeing whether there's another round of funding, given what the problem is, particularly, and whether they're comfortable to live with that, or whether they need to think about whether some sort of restructuring needs to happen in order to get more money from them. And that might fall into any of the categories that I've covered today, where maybe there's a part of the business that shouldn't be continued, and they're happy to invest in the part that survives or the parts that survive. That conversation also needs to happen much earlier than going to them when you say, sorry guys, investors, we've run out of money, we've got a big problem, can you put some more money in? They'd be going, no, there's no way we're going to put in more money given what you just told us. So early warning is also not for my advantage of giving advice to a company, but also for the investors or lenders to consider the position early on and come to a measured view. And it may be that they don't want to do that anyway, but at least you've tried earlier than just presenting a problem to them.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Any final questions for Neil? I think that's it, Neil. I want to extend our gratitude and thanks to you.
Thanks for inviting me, firstly. I had to mention that right up front. Thank you very much.
You're a great member of our community, and we love having you part of it. Mean that, and you're going to get a lot of love and big ups and hugs on LinkedIn today. That's what we do. So we just want to put that out to you and thank you for coming on and sharing your expertise with us. All right.
Thank you, Ollie, and thank you all for listening. It's been a great privilege. Thank you.